Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell. She and her daughter had already swiped the family's cash reserves. Kelly returned to her old job, where Harry was welcomed with open arms. Life without Harry went on as usual. Adriana went to kindergarten. Kelly's parents lived in a remote village near a large mixed forest. Her father worked as a gamekeeper. Her mother worked around the house. The household was a noble old one. Betty knew how to do everything. Often joked I was not a villager, a forest dweller. In our house, behind which you can already see the forest, as lives hares and deer. Even the chickens and ducks have long since gotten used to having wild animals in their yards. Lived different on their farmstead, and indeed has always been a lot. Molly, her favorite cow, lived in the barn. Then a calf joined her. Jack joined in the dog barn. There were well-fed pigs, naughty goats. They were always running off into the woods. God only knows how Betty managed all those pets, but the garden was not spoiled. On their almost northern lands, only potatoes grew well without beets with cabbage and carrots. From fruits, all apples were berries. Only cranberries from the bogs my husband brought Betty, apparently invisible. All day long the woman fought with livestock, poured, pickled, sautéed cabbage, processed huge harvests. Forest, mushrooms rubbed in berries with sugar. On hard labor never complained. She and her husband lived soul to soul. Only God didn't give them children for a long time. She had Betty. Very late by the standards of those years. She was already 38 years old at the time. All hope of having children was almost gone. Kelly was born into the world, healthy and strong. Maybe he even liked to make jokes about it. Kelly, dear, wasn't the birth of our daughter the result of that sudden passion that came over us then in the berry meadows? Betty, oh, how she resented it. Her husband didn't talk about love carrots and carrots very often. She just knew from somewhere that he loved her more than his life. And when all the right words, that time. Of course, she remembered she had brought her husband a basket of lunch in the forest. It was a rare hot day for their region. So wanted to warm up in the rays of the unexpectedly generous sun on the world of lice. Stephen would have burnt her in a bundle, both drowned in their sensations for a long time. They couldn't get enough of each other until Betty realized, Stephen, honey, let me go. There's a beast waiting for the water. I've been singing and singing to them today, but it's been such a hot day. The trough and bowls are empty again. The woman rose easily from the grass, quickly threw on her clothes, and disappeared into the green opening. Among the bushes, Stephen saw to it that she moved as far away as possible. Then he moved in a completely different direction. Not the one he'd mapped out before that was no longer in his plans for the day. Far away in the woods, he carefully kept the secret of his ancestors from everyone. Subdued it in an old abandoned cabin. No one in the neighborhood knew the way through the furnaces of the swamp. Only he alone sometimes visited the relics sacred to the people, which could make many greedy hearts tremble. The details of her parents' lives Kelly did not know well. As it happened, the village where she was born had become increasingly decayed. Closed schools club, hospital, the last grocery store was breathing on a lumbres. Sawcos, knowing the bosses, threatened that soon trade in general will go to the shops, traveling to the village. Once a week district centers, larger and richer, also went through hard times. Where to keep a separate state farm? I know a brigade of 100 houses with a complete infrastructure at its side. Events ran in a vicious circle. Young people were fleeing to the city under any plausible pretext. It would be better to keep them, or at least wait for them to get the right profession and return to their small homeland. So where to go for young families without basic social amenities? Trouble. As a result, only about a dozen of the most persistent families who loved the forest and fresh air remained in Brigada. Betty and Stephen were among them, but Kelly, already at the age of 6, had to be taken to the city boarding school. By that time, there was no school left in the brigade, even for elementary school. Stephen couldn't leave the forest and didn't want to for any city's sake. His parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents had once lived on these lands. This is where he met Kelly, where their beautiful daughter Kelly was born. Kelly was the kind of enthusiast she never suffered from. Somehow she became a city slicker. To the bone. No imagination or star sickness. It was something else entirely. When she was 3 at home, she'd made her only doll a dress with all the loose buttons she'd found in her mother's jewelry box. Furthermore, she lived in the house and to all the edges of the pillow covers on the bed, napkins lying on the tables under the vases and samovar, sugar collected and sewed between themselves. And all of this was already done at the age of 5. Betty grabbed her head, hid all the needles thread in the house. But such drastic measures didn't last long. The cunning little beast nagged sewing supplies in all houses, where only got to visit the neighbors teased Kelly. You shouldn't have named her Kelly. You should have named her Maria. She can't pronounce all the letters yet. And soon everyone in the brigade will be sewn together with harsh threads. There's only 2 or 4 of us left here. No one else can escape to the city. At boarding school, Kelly, surprisingly to her teachers, didn't miss her parents. She was a dull student, boring as a duty in math or geography. In labor class, the teacher immediately blossomed. Never guessed that all copies of the girl's apron with different bonds, embroidery, and colored ornaments or lace around the edges were made by Kelly's support pens. She was an absolute sewing fanatic. Home to her parents' house for the weekend would come up like a hurricane, a firework, a ball of lightning. Betty hid everything in the hut in advance that could be sewn on and survived. But Kelly remembered at home no longer spent time only in the company of needle and thread. To the great amazement of Stephen and Kelly, she fiddled in the stable with the cattle. Uncomplainingly, she fed the whole guard of her smaller brothers, some of whom were no small size. This is gonna sound funny. Kelly was friends with Jack the Bull, not a calf anymore. He recognized his young mistress and from afar pulled his white-spotted head towards her, the tender mood instead of showing that he was a real bull. Molly the cow was getting sick. It wouldn't be about milk anymore, at least just to support the old lady. She's been feeding the whole family for years. Stephen and Betty were country folk with a strange side, as the neighbors dubbed them, sometimes shouting after them, "You're out of your mind. You're out of your mind." That's the price he was offering for meat by weight, and they wouldn't turn their noses up at it. It's highly bizarre to hand over pets for slaughter, but they lived with all their meager yards side by side until the animals were old. And then Stephen would bury them in the woods, so that the wild beasts would not be torn apart. Only the chickens and their winged tribesmen would be spared. The maximum that Betty allowed herself was to collect a generous amount of eggs, to the rare preparation of chicken soup. The rest of the poultry yard she kept for breeding stock. Her fellow villagers were always happy to buy chickens and piglets from her. Such was Kelly's exotic family of nature lovers, flora and fauna. Events ran in a vicious circle. Young people were fleeing to the city under any plausible pretext. It would be better to keep them, or at least wait for them to get the right profession and return to their small homeland. So where to go for young families without basic social amenities? Trouble. As a result, only about a dozen of the most persistent families who loved the forest and fresh air remained in Brigada. Betty and Stephen were among them, but Kelly, already at the age of 6, had to be taken to the city boarding school. By that time, there was no school left in the brigade, even for elementary school. Stephen couldn't leave the forest and didn't want to for any city's sake. His parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents had once lived on these lands. This is where he met Kelly, where their beautiful daughter Kelly was born. Kelly was the kind of enthusiast she never suffered from. Somehow she became a city slicker. To the bone. No imagination or star sickness. It was something else entirely. When she was 3 at home, she'd made her only doll a dress with all the loose buttons she'd found in her mother's jewelry box. Furthermore, she lived in the house and to all the edges of the pillow covers on the bed, napkins lying on the tables under the vases and samovar, sugar collected and sewed between themselves. And all of this was already done at the age of 5. Betty grabbed her head, hid all the needles thread in the house. But such drastic measures didn't last long. The cunning little beast nagged sewing supplies in all houses, where only got to visit the neighbors teased Kelly. You shouldn't have named her Kelly. You should have named her Maria. She can't pronounce all the letters yet. And soon everyone in the brigade will be sewn together with harsh threads. There's only 2 or 4 of us left here. No one else can escape to the city. At boarding school, Kelly, surprisingly to her teachers, didn't miss her parents. She was a dull student, boring as a duty in math or geography. In labor class, the teacher immediately blossomed. Never guessed that all copies of the girl's apron with different bonds, embroidery, and colored ornaments or lace around the edges were made by Kelly's support pens. She was an absolute sewing fanatic. Home to her parents' house for the weekend would come out like a hurricane, a firework, a ball of lightning. Betty hid everything in the hut in advance that could be sewn on and survived. But Kelly remembered at home no longer spent time only in the company of needle and thread. To the great amazement of Stephen and Kelly, she fiddled in the stable with the cattle. Uncomplainingly, she fed and fed the whole guard of her smaller brothers, some of whom were no small size. This is gonna sound funny. Kelly was friends with Jack the Bull, not a calf anymore. He recognized his young mistress and from afar pulled his white spotted head towards her, the tender mood instead of showing that he was a real bull. Molly the cow was getting sick. It wouldn't be about milk anymore, at least just to support the old lady. She's been feeding the whole family for years. Stephen and Betty were country folk with a strange side, as the neighbors dubbed them, sometimes shouting after them, "You're out of your mind. You're out of your mind." That's the price he was offering for meat by weight, and they wouldn't turn their noses up at it. It's highly bizarre to hand over pets for slaughter, but they lived with all their meager yards side by side until the animals were old. And then Stephen would bury them in the woods, so that the wild beasts would not be torn apart. Only the chickens and their winged tribesmen would be spared. The maximum that Betty allowed herself was to collect a generous amount of eggs, to the rare preparation of chicken soup. The rest of the poultry yard she kept for breeding stock. Her fellow villagers were always happy to buy chickens and piglets from her. Such was Kelly's exotic family of nature lovers, flora and fauna. Adriana was determined, special. If she set a goal for herself, she went straight through the thorns to the stars. For as long as she could remember, it was impossible to try to do everything at once here and now. In the kindergarten teachers and teacher of methodical work, shoes whom you would blonde girls dressed beautifully for New Year's Eve performances. Little Adriana with a big curious ear, already standing under the office door when they sleep during the day with everyone else. If there's such a global issue to be solved in music class, step forward and give an ultimatum. Clara, I wanted to tell you one of my mom's secrets. You have them by mistake. We were making costumes for Santa Claus for the winter festivities. So my mom made me a little outfit out of fabric scraps. It's gonna be beautiful for our matinee. Such a glamorous prospect, laced with charitable sponsorship. No self-respecting daycare center would refuse. The press school where the little intrigue went could hardly boast a decent budget. So to the stunning blue and white costume of Santa Claus's helper, young Adriana herself was added. Her mom, Kelly, will not tell the teacher and the entire kindergarten staff that no costume for Adriana was needed at that moment. Cunning Vixen this evening washed the glass now to her mother, excitedly telling her that she won the contest, beat all the little blondes in the group. And now she needed the most beautiful, the most colorful costumes of the New Year's heroine, without whom no real fairy tale holiday can do without. Kelly was a master of the universal. Since childhood in love with her profession of seamstress, she would create the patterns herself model, and in her life embody to shame the honor of the uniform. She certainly could not refuse the costume for her daughter was ready. It turned out bright and cheerful, promising. All the performances and kids and their parents were mesmerized watching all the movements of Adriana around the fluffy Christmas tree, and a little faith in the fairy tale. This Christmas will definitely bring everyone new happiness and prosperity such a ruddy and cheerful Kelly cannot deceive. Kelly, too, was sitting in the midst of the audience, admiring her daughter, but not the most life-affirming thought in her head. Harry, there wasn't enough to go around. Next to her and Adriana, it could have been a tight-knit family. But he chose love not for her, but for him and the green snake that cursed him. So he disappeared somewhere on the endless expanses of the motherland, having gone on a shift with a brigade of builders. He was a bricklayer, golden hands. Earlier in the week, another one. Harry kept well. Not a drop in his mouth, but then he'd break down anyway. He'd go on a deep, dark bender. The kind where the victim of the high doesn't remember himself. Return to the sinful earth from the murky clouds of wine vapor exhausted. Gritting his teeth, then worked like a slave on the galleries to make up for lost time. Brought home a decent penny, guiltily looking into his wife's eyes. Once he didn't return from a shift change, as usual, as if he fell through the ground. Guys, colleagues only put their hands together, Kelly. Don't hold it against us. We were finishing a project. It was all in my head. Harry was ahead of the curve on the ancillary stuff. His honor was long overdue. Success was celebrated, as usual, but he went into another corkscrew. When everyone woke up after a night of indiscriminate behavior, he was nowhere to be found. Vanished into thin air. The rock construction site is huge. Still piles of garbage waste not removed. Not all the holes and pits from the haul tons of it. Seemed to have looked everywhere for him for 3 days. Nothing. At first, Kelly still had hope. A search was initiated. The police department took a missing persons report a few days later. Yeah, fair enough. The smiling senior lieutenant explained no body, no case. Maybe your spouse went on a bender and you're crying for nothing. 6 months later, when little Sasha was just 3 years old, the case on the disappearance of Harry was closed with the note, "Missing in action." She was different in upbringing, in spirit, in principles from her peers. She was in many ways a white crow, old-fashioned views with a complete absence of mercantilism inside. How many then in sewing technical school girls in the dormitory told her, "Kelly, you have talent. You listen to everything from the picture of a fashion magazine. You should really open your own atelier. You'd have tons of customers." What atelier? The only hope is that the technical school won't turn into a colossus on clay legs, and she'll be able to get her degree in time. No light industrial technologist. She doesn't want to go any further. She likes her future profession. A specialist in the modeling and design of garments. Oh, and also a production organizer. To lead even a small team. Then somewhere on the wrong shop, she would not want. Only with her own hands, only at the working machine to hold the fabrics. You can already see the finished products in her. It's such creative bliss. But all her rosy dreams of being a great fashion designer almost came crashing down from the heights below. Kelly fell in love with the impossibly good Harry. Their educational town stood toe-to-toe. 3 schools at once, 2 technical schools and a construction college. In it then Harry learned the basics of specialization in the construction and repair of masonry structures. Charismatic, the future builder was such that the girls fainted, and stacked fans stacked. Kelly first saw Harry in gym class. The guy laced up his sneakers before running, and then after the teacher's command suddenly beautifully got off the ground and did not run. Not at all. He flew gracefully like a snow leopard leaping for prey, like a pure leopard stalking its prey under a sleeveless tank top, his muscles stalking. With each movement, his strong legs pushed off and froze in midair for 1/100th of a second. Kelly didn't realize she was watching him with her mouth open in amazement. It was the second time her gym teacher had yelled at her for freezing like a statue. "Because of you now, false start. Everyone has to go back to square one. If people are meant to make love, heaven will take care of it." Kelly and Harry ran into each other in the cafeteria the very next day. It must be said that the girl was the first fashionista in her technical school. Even the female teacher measured on the move primitive. What was the next outfit Kelly was able to make herself? The girl certainly could not be called the first beauty of the educational institution, but she was a style icon. Harry, who had just removed the plates with the first and second course from under his nose at the sight of Kelly in a bright blue dress with white trim, at first moment taken aback by the brightness of her image, followed her with his eyes, then resolutely put everything back on the tray and made her way to the table where Kelly was disembarking with her friend to have lunch. "Girls, let me keep you company." There were no tables left in the hall at all. Harry's group of fans pouted resentfully. She hadn't expected this from her idol. At that moment, the ranks of Kelly's envious fans swelled, but she didn't care about that. She had already dissolved into blue eyes. The boys were flying through the air, sparks a little more, and between these young men was ready. There was thunder, and the lightning was certainly sending electric shocks all around. Their romance was developing rapidly hot. They might even have abandoned their studies. But Harry and Kelly's genuine passion for their professions intervened. Now the boy was even more filigree in laying bricks in the next masonry. In practice, he calculated the strength of the future structure in theory classes and then ran to the dormitory to quickly complete his homework. They had already decided with their beloved, though they were both still only a few years old. Immediately after receiving their graduation certificates, they will get married. Kelly went the other way, got the latest issue of a scarce magazine with, modeled a stunningly stylish business suit from there. Then she and other graduate girls went to the crowded clothing market, where in the 90s you could buy even an elephant. A cunning old Jew, a famous tailor in town, had a whole network of shuttle traders to Turkey. From the countries of the socialist camp in Europe were already in full swing across the borders with their huge plate bulks. On the pages of an international women's publication, the future partners first saw Gordy Gann. How could they know that the French queen of fashion Coco Chanel invented this thing back in 1925? To the vast Soviet expanses, this diva managed to fly only in the closet. The spouse of a man from the highest echelon of power in the province had never heard of such an elegant Judy. With the help of a hint of experienced Uncle Samuel, the most suitable coloring of jersey was chosen. Smoke gray tone with a light silver olive. Kelly and her assistants labored over the gift for the principal of the technical school for over a week. The present was received favorably. Examinations and credits in this issue of Qualified Seamstresses were passed on marks good and excellent, without a hitch. The culmination was conscientiously prepared diploma projects together, with models of new dresses, suits, and even pajamas. Into adult working life, Kelly jumped out as a very well-prepared professional. Harry, Stephen, and Betty's mother did not consider the marriage to be one of falling in love with each other. Kelly and Harry is something so hasty. The boys got a profession even in their small town. Despite the general devastation in the country were any active construction sites, still worked atelier and a small sewing factory, promises, girlfriends, and moods. Her talent could not help but sow seeds in the soul of Kelly. The three of them with two fellow students, they still decided to open a tiny enterprise for tailoring and custom orders. The whole threesome was like a match. One of the girls was great at drafting. Even Kelly was good at any pattern. Another had the world's smoothest stitches. No one would have guessed that they were made on the simplest cervical machine without the use of modern equipment. This useful skill made their sewing creations subsequently indistinguishable from the authentic firm. Dresses, suits, skirts were sold like hotcakes. There was a rumor in the city that you can find a fashionable outfit for a special occasion. No one touched the girls at the clothing market. Even the local rooftops were bypassed. The secret was simple. They were taken under his patronage by old Uncle Samuel. Turned out to be a personality, advanced, with his nose to the wind. He supplies the young necks with labels, all sorts of other foreign tricks. They set him up with interesting clients with money. In the distant northern province appeared and was already gaining momentum new Russian capitalism, with wives and daughters in the form of inexperienced businessmen and homegrown individual entrepreneurs. Harry was not lagging behind his young wife. A flock of newly emerged nouveau riche rushed to build elite houses on the principle of the country look what I own. Dexterous, quality mason was in high demand. He was passed from house to house as a banner on the hand of Kelly and Harry. Word of mouth was also playing. The number of clients both grew and multiplied. Money flowed into the house in rivers. One thing only upset the young people. Stephen fell ill in the village. Such a sturdy man fell into the clutches of mud when he was once again inspecting the forest land. Heavy rains caught the gamekeeper not too far from home. A noisy avalanche of water on bushes and trees instantly wet the ground under his feet, inventing for himself at least some shelter. It was too late. Stephen tried to hide. How the lightning calculated that in the vast forest under this very tree was hiding its potential victim. Only the heavens know how it struck. So the man's eyes all darkened from blackness and sky, as if someone's hand violently threw down a glittering fire. The spearhead of the trunk cut through like butter. Half of the tree fell on Stephen, lifting him beneath it entirely. The crown above blazed brightly with what? Later, the villagers marveled how Stephen could have survived in such a mess. He didn't even immediately realize what had happened, and then he lost consciousness from the painful shock. He woke up a couple hours later in the forest, even almost no traces of rain and thunderstorm. After some effort, moved towards the merged a piece of wood with branches sticking out in different directions, fumbled at his hip for a travel bag with a small bird in it, injected himself in his arm and an anesthetic. The only thing seriously bothering him was the one thing he couldn't feel at all. But he would deal with that later. Now he had to get out of here somehow. It was almost completely dark. Kelly, not for nothing. She'd been a battle buddy and forest administrator for so many years. Smelled something wrong as soon as the dark clouds thickened over the house, saw to be strong thunderstorm, not unlike the usual vagaries of nature, washing her heart. When her husband did not return at his own appointed time, the rain had already fallen, gone into the woods. Didn't venture out alone. She ran after her neighbor. It's easier with two. Then I called my neighbor, and a couple more men joined us. There were less than a dozen residential yards in their brigade, but Stephen was obeyed and respected by everyone here. The huntsman found the path even after the rain without any problems. Who lives near the forest? All primates and bushes are rolled to the side. They'll notice the twigs right away. Even though the blue night inkwell has already fallen to the ground, they didn't put off the search until morning. And this time, for some reason, it was unsettling. A couple hours later, they heard a faint sound. Stephen by that time had already made several attempts to crawl, but all of them were futile. The effects of the injection were increasingly wearing off. The pain persistently returned, drawing him more and more into its agonizing captivity. Home the gamekeepers hauled out and built up the tarpaulin. One of the searchers was a medic by trade. That Stephen had a spinal cord injury. He determined immediately without any x-rays. Then everything went according to the scenario assumed in advance by the former paramedic. Long examination in the city hospital, where Kelly and Harry raised all their connections. Among the new Russian concilium consultation and recommendations, doctors are not gods. Even wasted on medicine, savings, popular seamstresses and stonemasons with golden hands could not perform a miracle. The verdict of all of the fists was unanimous. Damage to the spine is so serious that the motor ability of the lower limbs cannot be restored. So, you were born with your shirt on, my little dove. What could ask for more from the Almighty? You won't be able to walk, stand, or even sit anymore. You're going to be horizontal. And no matter how much Betty persuades her husband that the main thing is that he's alive, that he's by her side, they get through the rest together. At home, Stephen was very worried, lost his appetite, lost interest in life, in his wife and daughter, would not let himself be washed, walked all the time only getting angry, And in rare moments of enlightenment, he told his wife that I could not live without the forest. He was dying of longing, and the whole white world was for him. Betty brought into the house an armful of branches drawn in the forest, so that the spirit in the hut was appropriate. He sat, dwelling for an hour or two, and then grew even more gloomy. He was floundering in doubt whether to initiate his wife into his secret. At the same time, Kelly and Harry were working with renewed fervor to replenish their money box. Harry was on another construction site from morning till night. Lena had many more opportunities to please the customer with exclusive outfits. Fashion magazines were not only brought to her in abundance, they were now even sometimes in the newsstand could be bought. Owners of luxury real estate houses in the city grew like mushrooms. After the rain, more and more people paid Harry not only in cash, but also in food and drinks. The handsome Harry did not cause them visual rejection. Always clean, cultured, polite. What with such a one not to celebrate after a work shift the beauty of the future construction? Almost every working day now ended with a drink. Dashing bricklayer began to return home constantly drunk. For a healthy man, a couple of drinks after the labors of righteousness is nothing. By and large, neither Kelly nor even Harry himself had no idea that his mother had given birth to a boy from a stunningly handsome but legal drunkard. Even the most illustrious geniuses in medicine can't say for sure whether heredity or all human speculation is possible in such matters. Harry's mother hid her son, who was really his father. He did. The first thing that came to mind seconded a man she had an affair with. Married man. They split up right after he left. In fact, the unfortunate Harry's dad was the first guy in the village in the woman's home village. Handsome, but rough and tumble. Even the local young widows didn't ask him out anymore. They'd had enough. Pigeons his beauty is not earthly, and then he gets drunk and count all the panes in the windows, if you don't want to let him in the house like that. Mother's love. Harry with this handsome twirl at the dance at the club he that night was indigestion, and was for this reason sober slow dance-led, confidently looked uninterruptedly in the eyes. To court, to present himself to a woman on a plate with a gold leaf. The local catcher managed to shine after a hug to the music volunteered to escort to the open windows of the girls' bedrooms, jumped as on the footboard of the bus, that to the district center of the villagers took the villagers. Harry's mother didn't mind. She was about to turn 25, and her personal life is still not glued. Nobody needs a simple kindergarten teacher. It's okay that her current companion is 5 years younger than her. For the case she's working on, he'll do just fine. She's decided to move to the city for good soon. I found a vacancy there as a junior high school teacher at a high school in my small hometown. The school was full, so her hard-earned diploma is still sitting on the shelf for nothing. And a city is a city. Even the modest salary of an elementary school teacher there was twice as much as her current income in the village. Simple arithmetic. And men of young age that could make her a match here is not day with fire. So the right decision would be to have a baby for herself. Her mother raised her alone, so she'll understand everything. And with a potential grandchild will certainly help. A recognized village Don Juan with good looks. Okay to them body was the right candidate that will be able to quickly help in all her plans. After a couple or 3 non-committal one-night stands, the odds were right. She got pregnant. The single turned out to be a pretty good nobody. She had to prove it to her mother. You're right not to drink water off your face. Men are handsome. They always get a good life anyway. If he's not much of a man himself, there's bound to be a young lady in love who'll drag him along with her to the top of the career. The glory of creativity. Wise people say that behind every successful man is always the right woman. And I completely agree with them. Not all plans. Mother's Day happened to fit on the perfect list. The oncology wound is gone. Mom conscientiously raised her grandson to the age of 7, while the daughter in the city mastered. The house in the village with a small vegetable garden was sold for nothing. But this sum, strangely enough, was enough for a cozy one-room apartment in the city. The country at that time was just climbing out of the horrors of the dashing 90s. Only the new rich had money for real estate. The rest of us had to scrape by. As God would have it, it didn't work out so far. At school, the first-grade teacher never rose above that position. But respect in the team could earn a woman. She was practical, strong, and rustic. He'll get up early to bake cabbage pies for the whole teaching staff at 4 o'clock at night. What's night? It's quite a working morning. In the village, it is on duty in the prolongation of all the married ladies, always hurrying all home to their husbands and offspring. At the Saturday cleanup for the holidays, she had the most difficult windows to wash in preparation for the New Year's Eve ball. No one else more than her sliced fat snowflakes that then fluttered their windows clean. Harry grew up a normal guy with no tricks. He wanted to be a stonemason himself. He was fascinated by everything that a man should do with his hands, and his hands were dexterous from childhood. At the age of 15 already, all the men's work at home performed without problems. Everything about him was worthy. No one expected that he would stir up the bad habit of his own daddy and even multiply it. Bad heredity. On this, his intrigues ended the hunters for an endless string of new Harry did not grow up. Excitement female around himself, since the school desk perceived even with some surprise at the real, and forever fell in love. Only in Kelly was faithful to her, without a single compromise and desire to go left. And she paid him back with the same loyalty. Realizing he was drowning more and more in the treacherous vodka degrees, she tried to fight for every sober day he had, but he was falling further and further into the abyss. The rare periods between binges were getting shorter and shorter. Who knows? Maybe the heavens, watching her torment with her husband, decided to deliver her from this strong cross so cruelly and mercilessly. When Harry and Kelly gave birth to Adriana, as they lovingly called the daughter of men held out for 6 months, dragged into the house every Shabbat, and all the new toys, somewhere then got a huge plush, somehow from Green Elephant, with a funny trunk, with which the baby very much liked to fall asleep in an embrace. When did the husband disappear, Kelly cried all her tears. She abandoned her little sewing enterprise, having lost all interest in it from her co-worker's girlfriend. At first, everyone expected her to step back to accept her loss, but it was all in vain. Her fantastic ability to create extraordinary clothes died in Kelly. Her eyes faded. By the time little Adriana went to kindergarten, she had already completely closed her atelier, saying to her comrades, "You continue my business, but I have no need for it now." But how can you continue if the generator of ideas has died? It shrank, stopped falling asleep and waking up with a needle and thread in his hands. Nothing to do. Kelly certainly didn't stay. People like her are a gift from God. At the factory, the masters had their hands full. Her workdays were now a chore, which she managed with flying colors. But her creative streak was dormant. Adriana grew up to be such an engine of progress. Everything that was new around her, she mastered with enthusiasm. At school, she was an honor student in the student band, a leader in the youth club corps, soloist in the theater group. That's how she and her mother lived, clinging to each other. One thing Kelly couldn't understand was where on earth she'd come from. Her daughter, having such a graceful and fragile appearance. Looking at her, there is a feeling that some talented sculptor molded from fine porcelain. It's aristocratic perfection, small in stature, though perhaps not Thumbelina at all. A graceful head with a luxurious mop of blonde hair, beating all at the tips. Blue eyes, fairy tale Malvina. Beautifully outlined lips, matte, delicate facial skin, slightly pulled snub-nosed, narrow cheekbones with a peachy blush. Not a girl, but a princess from an ephemeral state. With slender fingers, dainty ankles, a cheerful, lively look. Men are always on the lookout for such a person. They want to grab them in a strong embrace and not let them go a step away. But with Adriana, such attempts did not pass. She had the physical training of a miniature brave warrior. TE classes, competitive tennis, swimming. Adriana rushed to get involved in everything. She was determined, but at the same time very soulful young ladies, friends mostly with boys, immediately rejecting their attempts to become her faithful knight, or at least faithful servant Adriana. Such sacrifices were unnecessary. It's all just a level playing field for everyone. In the lives of Betty and Stephen, as their granddaughter grew and developed, things were moving on. The huntsman was able to break a little of his inner calm, raging in the soul element. The impetus for these changes was an acquaintance with a visiting doctor. "You, Vatenka, are offended at life." Pouting lips, grumbled the occasional guest in their house. "You think that your problems will be solved by someone else, and you are lying all poor and unhappy on the bed. Don't you feel sorry for your hosts?" Yesterday in the Rasputitsa, the car healer stalled a couple of kilometers away from the foreman in their fields, and Sit would be a foolish driver, who more often held in his hands a scalpel rather than the steering wheel of the car knee-deep in mud. Yeah, passed Betty on her way home. Stephen's house was on the side of the road. Passers-by were rare. She found the woeful traveler, having confused him on the highway signpost's tractor that pulled his car. And then she invited him to her house. It's easier to drive in the morning. In the hut, after a huge tea with pillows, we talked. The woman told about the trouble with her husband. The doctor volunteered to examine him. The huntsman and his wife did not know that by the will of fate in their house was quite a famous surgeon traumatologist. He became for them that and a ray of hope that he could make their home brighter again. The summary from the buzz was as follows. Yes, the local specialists were not wrong. Final recovery from an accident in the woods is impossible, but quality of life can be improved dramatically. After a course of rehabilitation, in which the exercise can be done at home, the man will be able to sit as long as he wants to move to a wheelchair and go outside in it, breathe a full chest, and live on with greater freedom of action. 2 weeks after he left, there was a knock at the gamekeeper's house. The engine of a large SUV was sticking out of the yard, and without even going into Cine, some man handed the head a box of books and mumbled, "Here, you have been instructed to hand over these manuals. It's clear, it's written, and I'm in a hurry. Figure it all out for yourself." Stephen did not start the exercises for another month. All musing with his finger on the pages, made notes, and then rushed into battle like an ogled, overcoming pain, and said to himself all day long, interrupted only to eat. They say that all our illnesses are hidden in the head. From there, the body receives commands to do what it needs to do, and what it does not need to do. Crippled by the storm, men were in moments of training angel and demon. All his inner strength wasted on getting up at least a little. It had been a long time since he had been in the forest hut. His heart was torn by the unknown. Was everything there in place? Had it been invented by random guests? How many times had he been tempted to reveal his secret to his wife and secretly watched his daughter? No, both women are too weak to carry such a burden. There's a granddaughter growing up. She's a different breed. To her and only to her, he would be able to entrust his many years of heartache. To learn to sit up again, to move deftly into a wheelchair, to finally see the woods from the backyard, and then to drive through the old immediate neighborhood. It took Stephen a year. Life in their hut near the forest edge has changed markedly for the better. During the lessons, the gamekeeper's hands became so much stronger that he began to help his wife around the house, sitting quite a bit. The livestock in the yard has noticeably decreased in the vegetable garden. Betty now planted a few vegetable crops just for the two of them. The children in town did without farm rations. Did they need much for two? Mushrooms appeared on the table much less often. So if we only went for a walk in the neighboring forests, big glass jars with berries rubbed with sugar were a thing of the past. We made do with apple jam. Some things were still stored in the cellar in abundance. We didn't starve, but we didn't get arrested either. They tried to expand their rations, only when Adriana came from the city on vacation. She was as thin as a white girl, but sober and militant, and both loved her immensely. The girl was unpretentious in everything. She helped with what she could and could do without tricks. So Betty went to the woods for mushrooms again, and took up laundry. Even grandfather took a nap, pushed and stole his left shirt in a cell with large pockets with buttons. It was quite gone by now. Released her into the hot soapy water. Suddenly, she thought there was something rustling in the pocket. Unbuttoned the button, Adriana pulled out an old black and white photograph. A heart. For some reason, the girl was excitedly reading from the picture. An old woman with a beautiful, concentrated face was looking at her, as if she was waiting for the promised bird to fly out of the lens. And then she realized there would be no miracle. It was a hoax. On the bed, Stephen sat restlessly by his collar. Adriana quickly tucked her find into her jeans pocket. She decided that since she asked the elders later, but her grandfather beat her to it, Shirko Zanozo once managed to steal my shirt from me, or rather her now. Too late, grandfather. The granddaughter laughed. Your shirt shrinks no basin along with the rest of the closet. Adriana even became frightened by the way the grandfather's face instantly turned white. He wanted to say something quickly, but only a bell and sounds came out of his throat. There in my pocket, important thing for me, you did not find anything. If you mean the picture, Grandpa, I reprinted it. Grandma will be back tonight, and she wanted to ask you, who is that woman? Don't even think about telling Betty about your discovery. You sit next to her. Your laundry's not going anywhere. I guess the time has come for you to know the truth. I've kept it from my wife for years that Kelly, and you're her daughter on my side, are descended from a noble family of Russian aristocrats. The level is high. Even the blood of the Romanov imperial family is involved. The authorities don't prosecute for such heredity anymore. And once blue blood and white bone gave your grandmother and great-grandmothers a lot of grief. Adriana's eyes widened in amazement. Her grandfather is a big man, a real bear in human form with a distinct lack of luster and gloss. That's the kind of thing she never would have thought of. Wait, Adriana not immediately falling into raptures for his secret. Both women, my mother and grandmother, had to pay too dear a price. Let me tell you how their fates turned out. My grandmother was marvelously good-looking little bright hummingbird, exquisite dress with lots of jewelry, fancy hairstyles, prominent cut eyes, just like yours now. What makes me so sure that you are very much alike? You'll find out a little later. Being a member of the highest society gave her carte blanche to attend all those entertaining social gatherings. There she was noticed by a 45-year-old widower from the position and rank of persons especially close to the emperor, fell in love like an inexperienced boy, like a young man who had never known women. He was ready to do anything as long as she was with him to get married. He did not fail to meet him already 3 months later very favorably. You bet a high-ranking official at court had something to pay for the love of a young, innocent girl, a potential bride, and no emotions were expressed aloud during the conversation. Only her matchless eyes of color and bright emeralds slightly darkened. Almost 30 years of difference between the spouses is a blatant alliance, but who paid attention to such things in those days? The wedding was lavish. All the aristocratic society showed up to watch a small and graceful woman go to the wedding. The ladies in the crowd whispered, "Oh, poor thing, such an unenviable fate. He's rich, of course, in good standing with the emperor himself. He owns 2 estates near San Francisco and somewhere even further north, I think near Canada. But for her to share a marital bed with such an old man would be an eternal servitude." My grandmother, meanwhile, was proudly stepping down the aisle of the church with her father leading her down the aisle. She dared not oppose the will of her parents. Lately, affairs on their own estate had been in full decline. Marriage to a wealthy groom could straighten out this groom's situation. She tried not to look. After a lavish ball in honor of the marriage of young officials, took his young wife away from the capital for 2 whole months. Your great-grandmother would be sinful to complain about the attitude of her husband to her person. It was warm, caring, attentive. If the public knew one of their little family secret, an important servant to Mr. Emperor would immediately be laughed at. And the matter was this. On the first night, the newly appointed husband knocked on the bedroom door. And at the startled entrance, that's what the newlywed declared: "I love you too much, my dear, to turn our wedding night into a nightmare." That's why I've taken you away to this remote estate to get you used to me. It's your birthday in a month. We'll have a reception in your honor, where I'll introduce you to the local society. Please consider our future, for I would like to have children by the woman I love, heirs to my considerable fortune. Your parents will know no denials either. You can tell them as early as your first letter from here. Other men would say it with a loving heart. Yes, he is a complete fool and has every right to take his own. Your great-grandmother's husband didn't want any coercion. He longed for her to come to his bedroom on her own, which he did not fail to inform her, and in their next conversation. Days passed. The young wife gradually got used to her new. To her surprise, her husband did not miss her, disappeared for household chores, went hunting, then disappeared for a few days. As it later turned out, he was away on personal business. A harsh official, one might say, and one of the key persons in the state, thought of giving his wife a present. And not just any ordinary one. The president chose a set consisting of Seriosa's necklace and a ring with emeralds of the same shade as her beautiful eyes. He actually loved his chosen one very much, wanting to cherish her for the rest of their life together. The famous St. Petersburg jeweler, as usual in the world of precious treasures, was Yerky. He immediately realized that a big fish with money had come to his salon. How many sets of emeralds had he not shown his client? He rejected them all. I have one supplier of exclusive stones from Colombia. Imports his goods just what you need: rich colors, juicy grasses, depths deep enough to drown in, impeccable purity. We have few people who can afford these pebbles, but jewelry with them is worth a lot of money. And the jeweler announced the amount. At first, the official's eyes even went dark. The cost of the set together with the work was prohibitive. But then he resolutely waved his head and said, "I will find the money. Can you order the stones? In the name of us, your great-grandmother, outlandish jewelry, stunning beauty, and grace were ready." He brought her the box in the morning, along with a bouquet of exotic orchids, where only he had gotten them in their land of harsh, even summer. But I am a grandmother was not from a pitcher of jewels, but even she immediately understood the gift. A true miracle. The stones so went to her eyes that it seemed that both were made of the same magical material. A little later, she overheard the conversation between two ubiquitous maids by chance, whispering to herself behind her velvet partners, "Our master, how did you sell that distant estate of ours? What was in the northern lands?" And there was a lot of land there. The mansion from the farmstead was wonderful. I've been there a couple of times, when for spring preparation for the season of the master's arrival, they collected all the servants, whatever he thought of, to get rid of such wealth. There's talk in the kitchen that he used the money to buy a present for his husband. That's how your great-grandmother settled down, on a soft banquet. I thought sadly, and what I'll really say with my face, my husband's not nice old, but his soul and bad. He must really love me if he made such sacrifices. In the evening, the young wife shone at the reception in honor of her name. Befriended her husband, waltzed through the hall, shone with beauty in the full splendor of dark green dress, golden lace along the neckline. The audience applauded. The charming two ladies went crazy with envy, barely envying what jewelry was worn on the culprit of the celebration. Some even ate green with anger, acquiring the very grassy color of flawless emeralds. That night, your great-grandmother herself came to her husband's bedroom. His reverent, gentle, heartful generosity, and did the trick. Gone was the resistance. Gone was the imagined hatred. Reason triumphed. Later, their marriage would always be built on the principle of one loves very much, the other allows himself to love. Everything was fair on both sides. My grandmother respected her spouse. In many aristocratic families, husbands couldn't dream of being treated like that. To be treated like that, visits to the marital bedroom naturally led to the expected result. A few months later, the woman realized that she would have a child. The spouse decided to mark this news in a peculiar way, declared to my beloved soul and the whole world the happiness of future motherhood. I want to capture this your state. On the portrait tomorrow, one of my familiar artists will come to us. I have only one request for you. Please wear that outfit and jewelry for basing that you wore on your birthday. The date is forever special to me. The painting sessions were enjoyable. Your great-grandmother would sit down to sew. In those days, in wealthy families, girls were taught the craft. The maestro picked up his brushes and created. They decided to create a small portrait to hang it in the light-colored walls of the bedroom. The head of the family kept joking. Now you're the only one being portrayed. And then, when the heir will be born, we will order a large image where we will be the three of us. Outside the windows of the mansion, where serene peace reigned, slowly moved. And by the fall of 1917, all three of the country's upheavals touched the family lightly on the edge in the form of disturbing news. The echoes of the war that was happening somewhere out there, not within the walls of their home, had reached them. By that time, the official had managed to resign, citing the emperor for allegedly poor health. He was now always at home and was not poor. The salary from the emperor played no role for him. The events in November 1917 occurred about a couple of months before the term that the rooster appointed your grandmother for labor went to the future mommy. Tough. Is it a joke, such a tiny baby and such a big belly? Winter came, opening the estate with a carpet of white and fluffy snow. From Petrograd came rumors of robberies and looting. The proletariat stubbornly followed the precept. Who was nothing will become everything. It became dangerous to be rich. Your great-grandmother's husband, not thinking long, stacked a set of emeralds in a velvet pouch, added a couple of gold coins to it, took out a gilded frame and a portrait of his wife. Once again, for the love of her lovely image, rolled it up in a tube, said 100 years behind. Start collecting all the important things in life. It will turn out that it comes down to jewelry that is not valuable at all for its cost and a portrait of the woman you love. Let all these things survive the years and bring no misfortune to anyone. The gut did not fail the master of the estate. The new masters of life, referring to ex-former in the city of everything that fell on the eye. One day they knocked on his house. The desire to enrich and abuse the baron brought into his possession whole armed detachments of vandals from among the proletarian class. The well-bred and educated official was like a bone in their throats. The husband of his great-grandmother acted with lightning speed, made his wife warmly dressed. He shoved a bag of atomic treasures into her hands and whispered to her to run away. The servants have long ago practically abandoned us. Only the faithful old nurse is left. But where should I send her to see you off? Through the gate in the backyard, you can get to the road to town on foot. Here are the keys and the address in the little room that belongs to the nanny. You got my last name now. Do you have any papers of any kind? No one will find you there. I'll join you later. My grandmother didn't see her husband step towards the angry crowd. They're already encircling his house from all sides. Seeing the lone defender of the manor, these people are only angry. Laughed in his face when he had time earlier. These men in a tulip already appeared. Jewelry box spouses pounced. Silently, mercilessly, fiercely after he had fallen. For a long time still pounded his feet in rough dwellings, but already breathless embarrassed us with this sight. Threw him into the yard on the snow, stuffed him with patter and earth, instantly sprawled. That ghastly, bright, blood-red stain. He didn't die right away, just froze in the cold. A few hours later, his heart stopped. All of us sat in our necks, then lost consciousness, then suddenly pops up in his back and darkness. In rare moments of enlightenment, looked at the snowflakes falling from the purple-black sky and whispered, "You only look out. You only survive. Sweetheart, I'm sorry. I found no other way to protect you." Once again, his eyes opened. The barren soul went to heaven. It wasn't walking anymore. It was almost crawling in the wet snow. It was good that the frost was not severe. Otherwise, she would have frozen long ago. Giving in to the insidious promising slumber, she mentally thanked her husband 100 times for the practical grid. He was on his way out when he slipped her a large, wide-waisted one. He realized that the cook had thrown them on in her haste. a great lover of this winter garment of bright cloth, with almost poisonous in color laces, a comfortable caftan without a collar. Fitted her big belly and her bag of jewelry too. She was afraid that she would be caught by someone on the road, and she would be killed for this unearthly beauty. And so there was still gold at the ready, and she could buy back her life for round red coins. She remembered her way to Petrograd as in a fog some lonely farmstead, where a kind-hearted old peasant woman let her spend the night, without asking anything, shoving only a piece of bread and a glass. God knows where the milk came from in this remote place. Maybe she was hiding a cow somewhere. Your great-grandmother fell into a blissful sleep. She had no strength left for fear. She slept for almost 24 hours. The old woman didn't touch her. On the road, say, forks clean you go already a bargainer, you will be recognized at once. If you're hiding from someone, you're in labor, take care of yourself. You still have children to give birth to and raise. With me, I stuck some more bread and eggs and 2 boiled potatoes. Don't be sorry. There's nothing else in the house. It was hard for me to get even that out. I don't want your child to starve to death before it's time. None of mine survived. Since then, all mothers are like daughters to me. The distance from the homestead and her husband to the city was, by today's standards, quite small, about 40 kilometers. She couldn't even name it afterwards. How many days had she traveled that distance? At some point, she joined the oboes with some people, going with loaded on top of the wagons loaded with stuff on the snowy road. She entered the town with him and found the nurse's room quite quickly. Their daughter was born 2 days later in a poor orphanage in the neighborhood of her present home. Survival was hard. About once every couple of months, she went to a staple where a clever salesman grabbed her fingers without asking too many questions. Another gold set with diamonds rolled up and into a tube. Portrait hid behind the fear on the street. Pre-wrapped, not helping paper. When later she told her girlfriends and daughters their Petrograd story, she often could not believe that it had all happened to her. She learned about what had happened to her husband a long time later, when she had given up expecting him to join her. She knew from somewhere that he was no longer alive. Her premonitions were confirmed with all obviousness. In Petrograd, there were always people marching through the streets. Where were they going? Why? She did not understand why it was so necessary to stamp their step and shout loudly the bravura words of some songs. Suddenly, the student's neighbor became her bailout wand. She and her husband were very friendly people. At first, the milk in the young mother's breasts quickly ran out, and her daughter had to be fed. Then they got a basket of milk or cottage cheese, which the neighbor made from the stock of her trade. She got out of it as best she could. Nothing. Raise your grandmother, my mother, like a sweetheart. A couple years later, I found out her parents had emigrated to France. They never traced them any further. They never looked for her. She made no attempt to contact them. The bag's stockpile of crumbs lasted until my mother's teenage years. In the meantime, mother and daughter worked part-time in a small workshop around the corner. Sewing and linen skills came in handy, which was instilled by my great-grandmother's parents in my youth. The craft, though meager, but could feed. There in a quiet courtyard, they quietly survived everything. This allowed great-grandmother to find a jeweler who bought several wonderful gold coins from her stockpile at once. It was a wonderful help, allowed them to make small repairs in their room, buy new furniture, change their clothes. Recently, she started to have a slight fever. By evening, she was tired even after minimal physical exertion, began to cough a lot at night, did not want to at all. Eat daughter all the time, frightened, skipped in the dark, when the mother could not for a long time. It seems that then one day on a mass handkerchief with a compressed card, your great-grandmother noticed bloodstains. Sometime in her time, she had already seen her niece in the family with such symptoms tormented. It wasn't hard to draw parallels. My grandmother diagnosed herself with consumption. Now it's more commonly called pulmonary tuberculosis. And she wasn't wrong. A trip to the hospital confirmed my grandmother's fears and the consequences of her hiking and winter walk. I called my daughter, showed her the set with emeralds. My portrait from a past happy life with the words daughter. I ask you very much never to sell these jewelry. To me their heart and soul of the woman of our family will become. Now you are their keeper. Then you will give them to your daughter or granddaughter. I promise, mother, that I'll fulfill your promise. Your grandmother answered her, and she kept her word. But we'll talk about that later. My mother was 17 years old at that time. She was just finishing high school. After burying her mother, she was wondering how she was going to live her life. She had to find a livelihood. Leningrad is a city of tsars and emperors, so she shouldn't hang her nose. As long as they were on the path, they'd continue their work. They don't seem to be persecuted. Then something more promising to fit the bill. In a small atelier where they sewed beautiful sets and linens with hand embroidery, made all these ladies' things, my mother received a good-natured welcome. She used to work here only occasionally. Now she had gotten into the mainstream that life had taken a new turn. There was enough money for a relatively trouble-free existence. Clients of the establishment were many quite famous in the city ladies, wives, elite, actress Julia, expensive kept women, mistresses of highly paid proletarian officials. By the end of the 30s, society tacitly began to divide again into those who had access to the state trough and those who earned an honest living. The atelier was buzzing with activity. A ball with a gala evening with a buffet and dancing was expected. All the wives of bosses who received a ticket to this party wanted to shut the competitors behind the belt of the circle of persons especially close to your black enterprise. Was well aware of the fact that in the atelier quietly for their own sewed evening gowns almost a la Parisian fashionista. We had some marvelous craftsmen who, whoever is trying to call the country western, your great-grandmother managed to teach her daughter not only to stitch lace for the anniversary, but also to work with drawings and shouting. She had excellent taste, excellent memory, real princely roots. Once she lived for her daughter at home, which also had a sewing machine, an old lady, stunning dresses for going out. My mother has not yet had a chance to show off in it, but she still found a gift. She put the needle and thread to good use, having bought a piece of not the most expensive, but distracting shiny silk color. Ashes of a Rose, I started copying. I copied the style, meticulously studying every detail, and drew every detail. As a result, the outfit turned out to be an absolutely magical miracle. You can't take your eyes off it. No one can cancel the vanity of labor. My mother brought her work to the judgment of colleagues who remained from the dress in full delight. That day, as luck would have it, everyone in the atelier was in a bad mood. In the morning, they were visited by the wife of the head of the local, already not unknown in the city of punitive bodies in Leningrad as evil cheeks. The woman did not like her outfit, ordered for the celebration of the October events. Leaving, she promised, and I will make every effort to have your girl turned upside down. It seems to me that my husband's people are bound to find something of interest here. The atelier manager was now shaking like an aspen leaf from the noise of every car approaching the house. Everything was falling out of her hands. The treasurer had managed to ruin fabric intended for another order. The clouds were gathering. Seeing your grandmother's creation gave the boss an idea we'd offer to a scandalous person. This one's a lie. Teach our office. Honey, my mom couldn't say no. Although I think the thing was a little pathetic. Her independent debut, by all accounts, was a success. The reputation of the atelier hung in the balance, however, and she waved her head decisively in agreement. If only she had known that this day would turn her life around. The wife of a high-ranking boss was absolutely delighted with the dress. What's more, it fit her exactly. At the gala, then in the dance hall, all the eyes of the audience were fixed on her, in an outfit of flowers, ashes of roses. Even the head of the city administration, confident that his wife at this ball cannot be overshadowed by anyone. The costume for her was delivered from Paris itself, was forced to admit the lot was above all praise. After the triumph at the feast, a natural dialogue between husband and wife took place. Where did you get this miracle? So different from what our Soviet women used to wear. If you share this secret with me, The woman did not think to be afraid. On the contrary, she immediately stood on her haunches. At least leave the cat at home. She applied a thick layer of flying cream on her face and smiled predatorily. I know you like the back of my hand, and I know you like the back of my hand. I remember where you started and how you achieved your goals by walking over dead bodies. Yeah, I've been a bit of an admonisher. Not to mix your work and my own profit, but I'm sorry. I couldn't help myself this time. It was the studio manager who was so stupid, she was hooked in the first place, and you got it. For me, this gorgeous dress of the ruler of triumph considered the dialogue ended there, but her husband had already bitten the bullet. He wanted to know who was so knowledgeable about aristocratic fashion. Where did the dress come from? It wasn't hard to find traces of the dress. During his visit to the hotel, the manageress, so shook in his heels that he only had to smile smugly. Comrade Major, this is the end of his investigation, and he was not going to get to the bottom of it. Who had dared to sew such a bold for modest Soviet reality dress? 3 minutes later, your grandmother was brought into the small office of the headmistress. Then her life took a different turn. Something happened that shouldn't have happened at all. A brave Comrade Major, loving to hold in his strong hands, beating himself in fierce hearts, fell in love at first sight, even in stern speeches for a few moments lost, and he immediately wanted to be a knight. That's the beauty of it. But the gloom dissipated quickly. He was used to getting what he liked at once. An insidious plan began to form in his mind. He would make this little girl his slave mistress, a slave to his every desire. How have you not yet had time to tell you that my mother was also born very neat, fragile, and gracefully carried all the features of Princess Chernysheva and a true aristocrat. Against the background of a 40-year-old man, she looked like a little fairy, met with an evil, ugly monster of a Comrade Major. And this contrast, only to be further inflamed. Finding out how the fancy dress came into existence was not difficult for him. The little seamstress told him in no uncertain terms how she had made it, but when asked where she was from, she could not and did not want to answer anything intelligible. Having finished the interrogation, the representatives of the formidable bodies were about to leave, throwing her a farewell without saying goodbye. We'll see each other soon. At home, your grandmother that same evening checked with her well-hidden mother's will and jewelry and the portrait. The treasures were still lying there untouched. Even moisture and dampness had not spoiled their appearance in the slightest. The seamstress was well aware that this was her meeting with Comrade Major. Alas, it would not be her last. Something gleamed in his eyes as he left the hotel, and that frost acquired her a longer skin. He knocked on the door of her room the very next evening. The clever subordinates had unearthed the girl's full background. Sitting down at the table, he shouted angrily, shouted well, Chernysheva books will take off your master's boots. The girl resolutely shook her head, making it clear that it was not so easy to break her. She was wrong. He jumped on her right there. There was always a beast living in his soul. His wife had given him a perfectly accurate characterization. He loved power. He reveled in power. He knew that with such a pedigree she would be sentenced to penal servitude. So she would take off his boots and serve him a shot of vodka when he came in. We'll get along. After he left, my mother pondered for a while and collected all the cash. In the house she rolled some things into a knot, added some breadcrumbs. A few lumps of sugar were scarce. Should have been her favorite treat. You put a piece in your cheek. Life seems sweeter. She went out into the horrible, unsightly night without looking back. To get away from here, to get away from here. At the train station, she took a ticket to some northern station with all the money she had left. And it turned out she was being followed. They were about to catch up with her and arrest her. But the Comrade Major, satisfied with his victory, was also sleeping sweetly at that moment, not even assuming that the bird of paradise had jumped out of the cage. On the way, all could not sleep. The whole body was coming down inside, rising and growing such animal and such a panic fear that it seemed to her that she would never be able to erase these terrible memories from her mind. At one station, A young man dropped into the compartment, looked her over from head to toe, wondering how the ladies were dressed. In our north, November can't even be compared to Leningrad's vulnerable November. And you're wearing a light coat, no hat, funny shoes, light. And the grandmother immediately realized that her traveling companion was quite young. He looked solid because he was as big as a bear. She could not explain to herself why she had told him everything honestly about what had happened. There was something about him that was so warm and manly at the same time that she felt her soul melt a little. She felt that he would not betray her or give her away. It was another 3 days' ride north. A random friend. A passenger carried boiling water for them in a cauldron and bought hot pies with potatoes or cabbage from a granny on the platform. The breadcrumbs were also eaten amicably. At one of the stations, the conductor warned that they would change the locomotive before the rolling stock had some kind of breakdown. A huge fellow traveler whispered to his mother not to worry and disappeared somewhere. "That's how it's going to be, my sweet neighbor. I can't look at your clothes without crying. While I was walking around, I thought I was the son of a forester. My farm is huge. I recently succeeded my father, who died. Let's go to my old lady's house. I won't hurt you. You know, Adriana, I honestly don't know how my parents lived their first years together. They both didn't say a word. Were you a snot-nosed mother? They never registered a domestic partnership. You won't believe it. My mother would hardly get out of the woodsman's hut a dozen times in her whole life, as if the heavens had an answer for their couple. There were small lakes, more and more swampy and overgrown. During the war, my father went to the front to fight, and my mother stayed in the forest to manage for him. The Germans didn't get there, of course. Where would they go? But the locals often came for mushrooms and berries. In the country was hungry all the best to help the fighters, and their commanders went away. And again, there was a gap between curious people and the forest ranger's cabin. New barriers were laid in the lowlands. Everything was already completely covered with moisture in those meadows, which were covered with lush grass. The water expanded and multiplied in the mud near the swamp. And my mother still lived in the mills. So many years have passed, and I still teach her. She does. Now she's knocking on the window. That major would pounce and plunge back into the abyss of wild pain. Mother did not hide from her companion that far away in her little room stored under pain of treasure fabulous prices. Time had given her an opportunity of ascertaining that her man was an honest man. Already after the war, on which my father did not get even a scratch, he was able to go to the post-blockade, still recovering Leningrad, where he found in your grandmother's apartment only dust and desolation. Surprisingly, this house survived and preserved for the future legacy of Princess Chernysheva. I was born 5 years after the war. My parents already did not think that I happy light with my appearance. But I came out healthy and strong, despite the fact that my mother was a miniature woman. Now my father was traveling to the nearest village. But even the most experienced locals came to us in the wilderness and were afraid. My parents had long ago equipped a small vegetable garden near the house. My father carried the little ones across the swamp in 2 trips. So my childhood was not only potatoes on the table. Yes, there were mushrooms, and also goat's milk in abundance. My mother liked to make cakes in the oven. I learned more civilized food when I was more than 10 years old. I went to school, a little late. I was already more than 10 years old then, but I learned the basics of arithmetic. My mom taught me. I read fast. There were only 3 books in the hut. They became my primer, and reading books in the class laughed at me, then did not dare. I was already a head taller than everyone else. Yes, a slouch in the shoulders. Then I was sent to a boarding school in the district centers, and after the 8th grade I entered the forestry college. Steve and I wanted to add something else to my story, but then Betty literally fell into the house with a full basket of mushrooms. He banned me right away. Adriana thought, "Why didn't you do your laundry? I've been on my feet since 500 am. And she's out here like a barmaid. Come on, put on your apron. We'll peel mushrooms. Later, we'll fry potatoes with the white beauties before they lose their forest spirit. Adriana quickly pushed a blanket under her grandfather and whispered in his ear, "We'll talk later. I want to know the end of your story." After a large portion of fried potatoes with mushrooms and sour cream and a large cup of tea with mint, everyone suddenly began to fall asleep. Adriana mumbled, "Well, now all the extra pounds on the sides will lie down. My friends in the city will not recognize me. They will say, 'What kind of a pie has come to us?'" She yawned and fell into a sweet sleep. Betty was quiet, too. Only Stephen remembered how for his birthday, his father brought him an old camera from the district center. He had bought this trophy device in a thrift store for nothing. The device was supposed to be packed with film, as many as 36 frames. He and his father had a long time to figure out what and how it worked, so they used up a lot of frames. From all the footage, he kept only his mother's cards, which he kept as the apple of his eye. The camera itself was lost in the swamp. When his father went with him to pick up new film, the intricacies of the photographic craft, he didn't know much about it. So he dragged the present with him back to the district center. He didn't even realize how he stumbled on the path, grabbed a snag, but he drowned his backpack. That's when he and Stephen set up the memorial markers to keep their paths straight. Stephen was glad in his heart that Adriana did not question him in detail. What happened to the set, to the emeralds? She did not seem to be a mercantile girl. He would be able to fulfill his mother's instructions and passed the jewelry down the female line of descent. Grandmother Adriana died early. All the same trials that fell on her share in life could not help but affect her health. The harsh way of life completed the overall picture. The cause of death was the same as her mother's. Weak lungs that had to breathe for years. Hail often pierced, rushing towards them from the swamp. She left quietly in her sleep. Mikula, and all at once. Before she died, she took her son's word that he would pass the jewelry to his daughter or granddaughter, only punished that her successor keeper must be strong in spirit. She smiled weakly and added, "Stephen, you'll see what I mean later. You're the heir to the big men. You won't be confused with anyone else." And then later, when they were already married to Betty and Kelly was born, Stephen suddenly recognized at once what his mother was trying to explain to him, and their daughter was definitely not an aristocrat, which Adriana turned out to be. Not everyone can be. On whom nature rests, a turn, learned men still. At last, and in the graceful sleep he was so calm, the tangle of a long history began to unwind as Adriana walked through the forest from two branches of thick trees, tiptoed around thorny shrubbery. Here, it is already a swamp with a damp haze over the treacherous surface. She knows the way. She is not afraid to step on the fly around the scattering of cranberries. And here is some other unknown berry. In the middle of the room in detail, she does not hang. Stretched portrait. Very beautiful women in green dress, gold lace along the neckline. Adriana freezes, scrutinizes the image, then shudders. The picture depicts herself. There is no mistaking that. But why is she wearing that old-fashioned dress? She doesn't usually get out of jeans and a fatty. And suddenly the woman reaches out her hand right from the portrait, grabs her elbow, grins, and says, "Adriana, and you do look like the whole female family of Princess Chernishiva. So you got to the old woman Forrester all by yourself, even without my prompting. It's all logical. The emeralds are yours now. Just find a way to get them out of here." The portrait and the old woman began to disappear into thin air. Adriana jumped up frantically, trying to grab onto something, and woke up. It was already light in Stephen and Betty's house. The first timid rays of sunlight were breaking through the sheer curtain, sliding cheekily across the surface of the windowsill. She seemed to know what she had to do now. In the morning, Adriana got a moment while Kelly was fiddling in the vegetable garden, peeking in on her grandfather. Stephen briefly told her what he had been thinking about during the night. His granddaughter told him her dream. He was delighted. She approved of you as the next guardian of female happiness in our lineage. That's what she came to tell you in that strange way. Go to town, find a trustworthy assistant in good athletic shape. I'm no longer a walker, but I've marked all the milestones on the map in detail. A competent man can get to the woodsman's cabin. You'll go with him. But why do you want him to know why you're going there? I shouldn't. It's too great a test of greed and material wealth. 2 mothers and a 5-year-old son got into the cab. The boy gestured for the woman to stop, telling her, "I'll pay. I have just the right 2 coins." "Why is that?" Adriana laughed. "It's simple. I am a man," the young knight explained to her. "And you are my favorite woman. But I'm your mother." Adriana objected. "One does not interfere with the other. If Papa Dima and I both love you, then you are the favorite woman for both of us." Adriana let her beau buy her ticket and sat him by the window, driving to their new apartment on the outskirts. For another 40 minutes you can stretch then to the neck of your legs. Memories swarmed through her head. Here she comes to the Extreme Survival Training Center and meets her future husband there. David was their trainer. Their romance spun quickly and impetuously. Already in a month they filed an application to the registry office. Now they have been together for 7 years. There's caustic growing up. This is with him and David a year after the wedding. When she found out she was going to become a mother, they went through a swamp. Took a portrait velvet, already standing in places, a bag of precious jewelry, already barely standing up. Stephen. He approved the candidacy of his son-in-law and guide in one person, before giving Adriana the treasure he kissed both earrings, necklace, and ring. He gave the portrait too. I was silent. I have not opened my galoshes all my life. It's too late now. May you have everything. Keep your granddaughter safe. Remember Grandma's instructions. Your happiness is in your hands. Adriana touched her purse, where there were ultrasound scans, the results of the medical examination, the conclusion of the doctors and their summaries unambiguously. This time, Mommy, you're having a girl. There can be no mistake. The young woman looked out the window of the shuttle bus and mentally talked to her great-grandmother. You see, I'm doing everything you told me to do. The emeralds are safe and sound in the safety deposit box. Soon there will be one who keeps a woman's happiness safe. Next. Back home, Adriana told the news to her husband and then turned to look at the wall. It seemed to her that the green eyes of the woman in the portrait had warmed, or maybe it was the play of light glare. No one would ever know. Wondrous are your deeds. Love.